Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Frontier Indica podcast. In this episode, I wanted to touch upon the Indian economy and specifically the living standards of common people in our country. Most of you would know that India still economically lags behind Western countries and even many countries in other regions of the world, such as Latin America, Southeast Asia, East Asia, etc., by a huge margin. But many of us don't realize just how far behind we actually stand compared to the rest of the world. So to make things clearer, I'll share some numbers with you. Firstly, let's look at per capita income. India's per capita GDP in nominal terms was around $2,100 in 2019. Sri Lanka's was more than $3,800. China's was $10,200. Germany's was over $46,000, while in the US, this figure was over $65,000. Can you see what I'm getting at? The average Sri Lankan is substantially better off than the average Indian. The average Chinese person is over 5 times better off than the average Indian. The average German is more than 20 times better off than the average Indian. And the average American is making 30 times more. Of course, this is a bit of a simplification, but you get my point. To get a more well-rounded picture, let's look at some other figures such as car ownership rates. The US has 838 cars per 1,000 people. Germany has 561 cars per 1,000 people. China has 196 cars per 1,000 people. Sri Lanka has 70 cars per 1,000 people. In India, this figure stands at a measly 28 per 1,000 people. Similarly, India lags behind on rates of almost all major electrical home appliances. Only 5% of Indian households have an AC, only about a third have refrigerators, and around 14% own a washing machine. Such electrical appliances are generally ubiquitous in the developed world and also available to a majority of the population in most upper middle income countries like China, Thailand, Mexico, and others. The very fact that the majority of our people still have to wash their clothes by hand, can't save leftover food in a fridge, or do much to protect themselves during heat waves apart from switching on a simple fan or cooler system just goes to show that we haven't really arrived in the 21st century as a country yet. The incomes and standards that most of you see around you, among your friends or your neighbors, aren't really representative of how most Indians live, and are more like the lifestyle of the top 5 or 10% of the Indian population. Coming back to our initial question, why have we remained so far behind? Is it simply the corrupt politicians or the incompetent bureaucrats or our cumbersome democracy or 100 other such one-line answers? Well, if the answer was so simple, perhaps we would have already solved this problem decades ago, or at least there would be no need for this video. Yet here we are. So the truth is, it's a multifaceted problem that is not just complicated to solve but also very difficult to even understand or to even describe. To begin making sense of it, let's first look at some of the most common explanations for our poverty which are espoused in the public space. The most popular one, at least among economists and policymakers, is that we were a command economy or a socialist economy for far too long. Strict barriers to trade, restrictions placed on businesses and private enterprise killed the atmosphere needed for rapid growth, and it is only since the beginning of the 1991 reforms which the Indian government was forced to undertake that we have finally started to see respectable GDP growth. To be honest, there is definitely a lot of merit to this argument because historical statistics show us that from the 1950s to the 1980s, India's real GDP only grew at about 3.5% on average every year. And because of that, the term the Hindu rate of growth was infamously applied to our poor performance relative to other developing countries. If we compare that era with the nearly 3 decades that have passed since liberalization, it becomes quite clear that we have seen a marked improvement in our state of affairs. As on average, the Indian economy has grown at 6% each year between 1991 to 2019. The difference in the pre-liberalization and post-liberalization period is even more stark than these numbers show, because our base was much lower during the former, while the population growth was also higher during that period. But is it really that impressive when we compare the achievements of countries like China, which has a similar population size as us, and managed to grow its real GDP by 9.5% on average each year in the decades following its adoption of free market reforms in 1979. In fact, even though China began opening up its economy only 12 years before us, their per capita GDP in nominal terms today is more than 5 times higher than India's. And China is not alone in overtaking us like that. Take another example, Vietnam. The country was significantly poorer than India back in 1990 with a per capita GDP of only $95, while India's per capita GDP was around $368 by that time. Fast forward to 2019, Vietnam's per capita GDP had risen to $2,715 compared to India's $2,100 in the same year. What is even more astounding, in fact, is that after COVID in 2020, the estimated per capita GDP of Vietnam has increased to around $3,500 and India's has declined to $1,800. So what exactly explains this huge gulf even after privatization with countries that do not necessarily have any huge natural resources advantage over us? Well, as mentioned earlier, some people like to pin this solely on the form of government they have, totalitarian versus our democratic setup. This theory basically goes that the Chinese government has a no-nonsense attitude to protesting workers, loudmouthed green activists, obstinate farmers, and other such pesky groups who may pose hurdles to industrialization. In India, the view goes our government is too indecisive in dealing with these elements, too soft on protesters and foreign agents, and too unwilling to push through reforms. Moreover, democracy under universal adult franchise effectively often means a type of mobocracy where whichever groups form solid vote banks are able to negotiate special favors for themselves at the expense of other groups. Reservation is a classic example of this, and we all know how merit is thrown out of the window for a vast majority of government vacancies today, simply because no party is willing to alienate big caste groupings which can swing entire elections. Undoubtedly, there is at least some cost in terms of lost growth that we are paying for due to our democratic system in a third world setting, where people are easily swayed towards mobocratic rule in practice. But that isn't to say that if India was a totalitarian state, things would definitely be better. Because as we have seen in China and the Soviet Union's cases, totalitarian leaders are also a mixed bag. And sometimes instead of seeing sky-high growth, you end up in a situation where millions of people end up dying in famines and gulags. The democracy argument aside, there is another possible reason why we still remain so poor compared to many other Asian countries. The theory goes that the per capita income of a country has a very strong positive correlation with the average IQ of that country. If you look at the IQ map of the world or a world IQ table, you'll notice that the Western countries generally tend to have IQs of around 100, while East Asian countries tend to hover around 105. And South Asian countries and the Middle Eastern and the North African countries, well, they're in the 80s range. And finally, you have the Sub-Saharan African countries in the 70s or below range. As far as average income is concerned, we can certainly see that these regions of the world will be ranked in a similar order, with the sole exception being that East Asia would rank right behind the Western world. Besides this, there are reams and reams of studies which show that IQ is one of the best predictors of individual productivity and or success in life. There is enough data to go around which shows that IQ is positively correlated with a host of critical outcomes, both at the individual level and at the societal level. Now the thing is that India's average IQ is around 80 or 82, and going by that, it is almost a certainty we will get stuck in the middle income trap. But wait a minute, some of you may ask, just how much is IQ a rigid biological reality? And just how much of it is actually possible to improve? Good question. The answer is, again, multifaceted. You see, we can express IQ in two ways. One is genotypic IQ and the second is phenotypic IQ. The former refers to the IQ score an individual would hypothetically receive if he met his full biological potential by having optimal environmental factors like access to good nutritious food and reasonable schooling while growing up. Phenotypic IQ, on the other hand, is the actual measured IQ in real life, where the environmental factors may or may not have been optimal. The problem, as we know in India, is that our mass public education system is completely broken. Many times you'll see reports about how half the children in 5th class in a government school can't even do maths at the level of a 2nd class student, or still have trouble reading basic sentences. This is further aggravated by a nutrition crisis. The publicly available data from the National Family and Health Survey 2015-16 showed that almost 38% of all Indian children were suffering from stunting, which is caused by a lack of adequate nutritious food. What's more, the same survey found that barely a tenth of Indian infants between the ages of 6 to 23 months were receiving a minimally acceptable diet or more. Another related problem is the problem of iodine deficiency, which is a huge cause of poor cognitive development. The brutal reality is that iodine deficiency disorders affect more than 70 million Indians, and in total there are 350 million Indians who are considered to be at risk of iodine deficiency. Studies have shown that the lack of adequate iodine in the diet, especially during the pregnancy months and while the child is between 0 to 7 years of age, can lead to a loss of 12 to 15 IQ points. Thus, iodine deficiency is considered to be one of the leading causes of mental retardation and cognitive underdevelopment of millions and millions of Indian children. So this shows us that while yes, no doubt our current low average phenotypic IQ does adversely affect continuing our country's GDP growth beyond the middle income level, the problem may be mitigated to some extent by progress in improving access to nutrition, better schooling, and specifically more iodine-rich diets. But how fast will we reach there? And when we've come close to realizing our genotypic IQ potential, will even that be enough to transform us into a developed country? All this is anyone's guess. Of course, going back to the point about our mobocracy, yes, I'm sure that these problems could have been fixed sooner if we had a determined leadership with all the power they needed without having to appease 100 different groups all at once. What's more, the way that our system works, it isn't too unlikely that we might even squander the IQ gains that we end up making by pushing out our best and brightest with affirmative action programs and keeping our entrepreneurs down with our inability or unwillingness to get basic contract enforcement and rule of law right. Any which ways, to end with, all I can say is that hope for the best but prepare for the worst. With that, I'll bid adieu.